Thanks for clicking! All exports coming from Canada will now be subject to a 25% tariff, as U.S. President Donald Trump has made good on his promises, with the exception, of course, of energy, which is only going to be taxed at 10%.
We're going to war.
Yeah, buckle up. And while predictions abound about the extent to which this will impact the Canadian economy, as Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem was quick to point out at last week's press conference, these tariffs are unprecedented in Canada, so it is incredibly difficult to judge how all of this is going to play out. Yet, the Bank of Canada has made an effort in its monetary policy report, and, even more importantly, it also did so back in 2019. In fact, back in 2019, the bank made 2 attempts to model what tariffs would look like coming out of the United States, giving us a total of 3 assessments from 2 different time periods about where the central bank thinks the economy will head on 25% tariffs emanating out of the United States. And, as we'll see, those 2019 predictions are particularly illuminating right now, as back in 2019, the Bank of Canada did not have any immediate policy interest, any immediate interest in the outcome of its predictions.
Is that important?
So what I want to do today is very briefly discuss bias in reporting, go over the central bank's outlook for tariffs coming out of the United States, both in 2025 and back in 2019, and then discuss some implications. This is obviously an incredibly uncertain time for the Canadian economy, but we will continue to track how these events unfold with a data-driven approach. Make sure you click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, let's get into bias in reporting. On to the report. First off, just a brief note on central bank bias. As we learned from the low to 2023 days, when the central bank issues messaging, it's trying to affect behavior. If it wants Canadians to spend, it's going to frame its messaging, it's going to frame its discourse and predictions in a manner that will entice Canadians to spend. Ergo, even if the central bank knew during the early days of the pandemic that money printing was going to cause inflation, it wouldn't have told us, as then people wouldn't have borrowed as much and spent as much, which would have created a bigger problem, a bigger obstacle for the central bank. It's called jawboning, and it's a very well-known technique among central bankers. So let's definitely keep that in mind as the central bank attempts to navigate us through these next few years. The central bank wants Canadians to borrow and spend to prop up the economy, so it's not going to paint an overly dark picture, even if it can see the picture getting darker. As if it did, then people are less likely to spend, less likely to borrow, more likely to save, which is going to make the central bank's job even more difficult.
Get him on the phone. Get him on the phone.
No, maybe I ignore your calls for once. Regardless, though, any analysis coming from the central bank isn't going to be any more biased than those coming from anywhere else. So as long as we understand that their analysis is going to be tinted towards a rosier picture, I think it's still worth seeing what they have to say, if only because it gives us some insight on how to judge future central bank pronouncements. On to the report. First off, how bad is it going to get? The report starts off by assuming that the United States is going to impose a 25% tariff across all goods, across all of its trading partners, including Canada, and Canada responds in kind. The bank then moves on to its benchmark calibration, or benchmark reference case, assuming that U.S. demand will respond to higher prices coming from Canada as it usually does, and that all of the changes will occur within the next 3 years. Under this model, Canada is instantly in a recession, with GDP dropping by 2.5 points over and above what it would have normally just in the first year, and then in the second year it gets a bit better, dropping by another 1.5 points. So, if GDP growth absent the tariffs was going to be 2% in years 1 and 2, then with the tariffs in years 1, GDP growth will be negative 0.5%, and in year 2, GDP growth will be 0.5, which means absolutely nothing to us at first glance. How do we qualify what a negative GDP growth rate means to the average Canadian?
I think it's going to be awesome.
Well, let's take a look. The only other times over the past 40 years that Canada had negative GDP growth was during COVID, the aftermath of the global financial crisis, the 1990s recession, and the 1982 recession. We are all well acquainted with what happened during the COVID economy. Moving back to the GFC, the post-global financial crisis economy, unemployment was at 9.8, followed by 10.2 in the early 1990s, and over 13% in 1982. So, and this really shouldn't be a surprise, when the GDP is contracting, unemployment jumps right up, upwards towards 10%, much higher than the 6.7% that it's sitting at right now. And just as a brief side note, in case we have any school children that are watching, or TD Bank, distinction without a difference, which recently said that these rate cuts brought on by these tariffs could be good for the housing market. This is what happened to real estate prices during those periods of negative GDP growth. Though, I suppose COVID was an exception, so if the government does plan on sending everyone $2,000 checks every month, and Governor Macklem is going to print up a few $100 more billion, then yeah, real estate could take off.
Fellas, I think I have an idea.
Regardless though, in the bank's benchmark case, Canada's GDP is going to drop 2.5% lower than it would have been without the tariffs, though the bank does note that GDP could drop 3% if there is a large decline in U.S. demand for Canadian imports, getting better in 26 and then dissipating in 2027. So a 2.5% to 3% drop in Canada's GDP on these tariffs, according to the Bank of Canada's 2025 predictions. Though something tells me this is probably a little low. So let's go back to 2019.
Okay.
Back in 2019, the Bank of Canada ran a similar analysis where the US tariffed everyone, including Canada, by 25%, and Canada responded in kind. The bank found back in 2019 that Canada could see a total decrease in GDP of 6%. And then, right around the same time, the bank found that under a similar situation, Canada's GDP could decline by 3.1% over the long term, though the report isn't specific whatsoever as to what constitutes a long term. Is it 1, 2, 5 years? The report does not say. So we have the bank back in 2019 when they had no immediate interest in the policy outcome, no immediate interest in how Canadians reacted right away. Back then, they told us that GDP could decline by 6% in total, compared to today's analysis, which tells us the GDP could decline by 3.9% over the next few years. Now, it's been 5 or 6 years, so maybe the bank has changed its understanding on how tariffs affect economic growth. Or, the bank understands very well that if it tells Canadians that GDP is going to fall by 6% and unemployment is going to 10 or 13, then they're going to be less likely to buy a house. And the bank, once again, is going to need Canadians to buy houses, as real estate and finance now represent 20% of Canadian GDP, compared to industrial production, the actual making of stuff, which accounts for 17%. And on that, 20 years ago, real estate and finance constituted 17% of Canada's GDP, whereas the actual making of things, the actual production of stuff, constituted 22%.
Everything is fine.
Regardless, though, the bank has given us its outlook for the economy with these tariffs over the next few years, and my guess is rates are coming down and they're going to come down hard. Though I'm not expecting it, I wouldn't be surprised to see an emergency rate cut announcement, which means the immediate next question by any expert should be, okay, but then what happens to inflation?
Whoa!
Well, we can ask the Bank of Canada, who, in its 2025 report, said that in the first year, inflation will be up 0.1% higher than it would have been without tariffs, 0.5% in the second year, and up 1% in the third year, which obviously doesn't sound that bad. Though it should be noted that that's just the bank's benchmark understanding of where inflation could be headed, and that inflation could go higher or lower, depending on how quickly businesses pass increases onto consumers. Meanwhile, back in 2019, when the bank ran its report, it noted that if the United States tariffs everyone, including Canada, by 25%, then prices in Canada could rise by 4.5% in the short run, though they would decline by 3.3% in the long run due to the contraction in the GDP, meaning that because Canada's economy would get so bad in the long run, it would force prices down. So, just to be clear, if we're talking to 2019 Bank of Canada, pre-COVID Bank of Canada, if the economy takes a hit, say from an externally imposed body, like the United States or the central bank, then deflation, or falling prices, is in fact possible.
Don't worry about those distractions. You keep your eye on the ball.
See, there is value in seeing what the central bank had to say before it had an interest in the immediate outcome. So, in summary, right now, in the bank's immediate forecast with these tariffs, GDP could fall by 2.5% more than it was going to without those tariffs. And on inflation, that's set to go 1% higher than it was going to over the next 3 years. A much rosier picture on these 25% tariffs than the one that was painted 6 years ago. And finally, speaking of 6 years ago, the bank took a look at how the U.S. economy, how the U.S. inflation rate would be affected on these tariffs, something they're not doing right now, and noted back then that the U.S. would see an immediate increase to inflation by 3.7%, but by 8.2% in the long term, and have its GDP pushed down by 1.1%. So, according to the central bank from 6 years ago, the United States is going to take a hit from these tariffs and from these retaliatory tariffs as well, though that's not going to be in the immediate term. That's more in the longer term horizon. Meaning, if this report is to be believed, then Canada's retaliatory tariffs aren't going to bring any immediate noticeable pain to the United States. Meaning, again, unfortunately, that we could be in for the long haul on this one. So, in summary, according to the central bank, Canada's GDP could end up 2.5% lower than it would have otherwise without these tariffs in the first year. Inflation could bump up by a total of 1% over the next 3 years, and the United States isn't in for as much immediate term pain as one would hope. And as we said earlier, this is a very uncertain time, and although we're going to see a plethora of predictions, I think it's important that we all remember that we approach these reports, valuable though they may be, understanding that each report we see has a bias, has an intent, has a purpose, has a reasoning for issuing that report in the first place. Especially out of the banks, out of the real estate boards, out of the central bank. They are trying to affect behavior with the release of these reports. And although the reports are worth reading, let's understand that they do have a point to push. We will obviously continue to track events as they unfold and how all of this is set to impact the Canadian economy on this channel. Click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, thanks so much for watching.